how the people are doing. So, now, if you're wondering, why am I even bothering with the Pro when I've already done the full-blown camera comparison, the photography comparison with the Vivo X200 Ultra against Huawei? Now, the reasoning is simple. You see, the X200 Pro is possibly the real flagship that Vivo actually launched globally. You can't really buy the X200 Ultra unless you import it from China, and that has its own set of concerns with the software. Like literally, if someone asks, the best flagship from Vivo is the X200 Pro because you can buy it globally, you can use the proper software with Google services and so on and so forth. You don't have to worry about half the things with regards to software that you would have to when it comes to the X200 Ultra. So in a way, this is a very practical comparison. Now, of course, there's another reason. The X300 Pro, Vivo's next real flagship, is coming out soon. And bloody hell, I can't wait to test that. And this is a very good way of reminding us exactly where the X200 Pro was good, where it suffers, where it could improve. So let's jump in. Alright, then kicking things off nice and easy with our color profile. So I think that the bright color profile that we have on the Huawei, it's not the best, it's not my favorite. It is very low contrast and not really my thing. And the same goes for the vivid colors on the X200 Pro. Now, if given an option, I would choose the vivid colors any day because it has such higher contrast, it looks so much nicer, so much less flat as opposed to Huawei. I don't really like the approach that Huawei takes with the bright mode. I'm sure someone likes it, it's made for some people at least, but not for me. Now my personal favorite color profiles are these two right here, for the respective devices of course. The original, the basic original color profile from the Huawei, and of course Zeiss natural colors. I said it before and I'll say it until the day I die. Zeiss natural colors is one of the most natural color profiles that you can have. Will it be 100% natural? No, of course not. But will it get as close to reality as opposed to just about any other flagship device that I've used thus far? Yes, absolutely. But of course, you might not want natural colors. You might want things that go far beyond. So in that regard, you probably want to use these color profiles right here, especially like the textured mode on the X200 Pro. It works really well. Now, despite the fact that the Huawei calls it vivid, it's not really. It's more of a high contrast look that we get. It's just a nomenclature issue, but trust me, if you use this color profile on the Huawei, you're gonna get contrast for days. And that, in a way, it speaks to me because I think it's a really nice thing to use. Inconsistency is gonna be a huge problem. Like even in this case, I think it's just way too crazy. It might not be something you want to use all the time, but there are certain situations when lighting might not be quite as nice, when this would work phenomenally on both. But of course, for the sake of this comparison and for the sake of consistency, we're going to use original on the Huawei and Zeiss natural colors, of course, on the X200 Pro. Now, in general, I think color accuracy is simply something that Vivo nails all the time. Again, not perfect, but very, very close to reality. Like this is about as good as you can possibly get. Now, naturally, there are going to be some people out there who don't want the realistic, the natural, maybe in a way, the boring look that we get from Zeiss natural colors. Well then, good news. We have a lot of options on both phones. Use whichever one it is you prefer. But simply put, considering all of the photos that I've taken and just the way colors are processed on both of these phones, I think the Huawei has basically two issues that results in photos that I'm not the biggest fan of. So in some cases, I've seen overexposing and that doesn't really look that nice. It usually flattens out the image and just gives you very low contrast, which again, not something you want. And it also can have significant magenta in certain images. It's not all the time, but it's definitely present over and over, especially in certain warm lit scenes. It's very obvious. In case of the Vivo X200 Pro, I would go so far as to say that the Pro version from Vivo has even better balance when it comes to both white balance and contrast as opposed to the Ultra. It's crazy. Like, I know this because I just did a comparison against the Huawei with the X200 Ultra, as I mentioned previously. And honestly, looking at these photos, it immediately strikes me that the consistency of colors and the accuracy of colors, it's simply better on the X200 Pro, which is crazy. And at this point, I'm sure you've noticed already, but if you look at certain bright white areas in these images, then you'll notice that it looks proper and white on the X200 Pro, while it can be a little tinted on the magenta side with the Huawei. So it's a minor difference. Look, is it gonna break your image on the Huawei, this magenta tint? Not all the time, but still, we are comparing flagships here, so nitpicking is part of the game. And of course, at this point, it should be obvious. Dynamic range is not going to be an issue. But take a look at the cross. Look at the sheer amount of sharpening we're getting on the Huawei. That's significant. And the Vivo, I would say it's a little oversaturated on the grass in this particular case at least, like it definitely stands out. But the sharpening is much more under control. The Vivo does sharpen, trust me, I know it does. But it's not nearly as crazy with the sharpening as the Huawei. And of course, this one is case in point, this is about as difficult of a natural dynamic range test that you could have for these smartphones. And yes, there's a little bit more magenta in the Huawei than I'd like, but it's still fairly well balanced to the point that, it doesn't bother me. The Vivo, of course, looks stunning. And honestly, I have nothing to complain about with dynamic range. It looks exactly as I would like on both. Now for the ultrawide cameras, and see, right from the get-go, it's immediately obvious that we have an issue on the Huawei with that magenta tint. Like, it's, I guess standalone, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, but at least compared against the X200 Pro, which is absurdly good at giving us accurate and natural colors, you can very easily tell the difference. But look, outside of that one little issue, I don't think once again it's going to be a huge difference or a huge deal on either smartphone, but it really goes to show just how well and fine-tuned the colors are. Now yes, I know I've been singing the praises about the Vivo's color accuracy over and over and over. Yes, because it's true, that's why. But there are certain situations where the Vivo definitely screws up. And this right here, this is one of them. Because you can very easily tell that the X200 Pro looks very clean, very white. And that's not how it looked. The Huawei, it is a little oversaturated without question, but the warmth that you see in the scene, that is very accurate. That's how it looked. All of the lights, literally every single one of them, warm lights. We also had that gold right there in the foreground, so it goes without saying that, yeah, there was a huge amount of warmth right there. So without question, the X200 Pro is overcompensating for that. And well, guess what? This right here, another shot that Vivo just messed up a little too much. Way too much warmth in this case. The Huawei is not doing a perfect job either. There's way too much magenta. A lot of the warmth is actually being taken out here as well. But at the end of the day, the Vivo, I think it's very obvious just by looking at it. The saturation in the yellow tones, the warmth in general is way too high. That's not how it looked. So I guess all in all, in terms of color accuracy, the main camera on the Vivo was exceptional. Like basically every single shot that I took is near perfect. But on the ultrawide camera, I'm definitely noticing some inaccuracies here and there. It's not a huge deal. We had like 2 shots out of quite a few. The Huawei is not bad. I think with the ultrawide cameras, the magenta tint seems to be slightly more under control as opposed to the main camera. But overall, there is an issue with the magenta, and I sincerely hope that they fix it. Now, dynamic range, once again, very similar story on both. Essentially, the only difference, and this is a personal preference for me, I like the higher contrast we get on the Vivo in general. When it comes to HDR shots overall, like main camera and the ultrawide, I've noticed slightly higher contrast on the X200 Pro, which I just prefer. It doesn't have to be something you prefer as well, just to be very clear. Now, macro photography. So both phones have tremendous macro capabilities. They're using the very high quality 3.7x telephoto cameras, and actually the sensor on the Huawei is the best, I think, on the planet when it comes to 3.7x telephotos. It's about as large as a main camera on the X200 Pro, if I'm not mistaken, which is a huge deal, and it's definitely bigger than the one we have on the telephoto. As good as it is, the sensor, the hardware is better on the Huawei. And regular macro photos, obviously, the Huawei can get a little bit closer, and the same goes when you're using 10x on both. So these are like hybrid digital crops, I'm guessing, on the Huawei as well, because I know it's a hybrid digital crop on the X200, but I'm not really sure what happens behind the scenes on the Huawei, but I can tell you this much. It actually looks better and more detailed on the Huawei as opposed to the X200 Pro, which is a huge deal. Like, that's beyond impressive, to say the very least. So yeah, I guess we finally have Huawei, which dethrones Vivo flagships for macro photography. Now then, with all of that said, let's take a look at detail preservation, because this is usually where we see tables turn. In a lot of cases that has happened, so well, let's see what both phones have to offer in this case. Now, 50mm 2x sensor crop, I think the Vivo's underexposing a little. Like, definitely this is not nearly as good as I would have hoped it to be. The Huawei's exposure, at least, is where you would want it. Now, in terms of detail preservation, at least with regular photos, like 24 megapixel shots that you can get from the Huawei and 12 megapixels on the Vivo. The approach is better on the Vivo. The Huawei just has way too much sharpening, and you crop in even a little bit, you can see that it's screwed up. I mean, we saw one of the shots just previously where without cropping in, we could tell the sheer amount of over sharpening that was happening. And that's not a good look. Now, of course, what about that 3.7x telephoto? This is where it gets interesting because if you remember, I mentioned that Huawei has the best 3.7x hardware or sensor as opposed to even the Vivo, which is again a huge deal. Now yes, the Huawei is absolutely going crazy with the warm tones here, I had to mention it. And in terms of detail, well, guess what? The Vivo is the one that's doing a better job. Now the reasoning is simple. Look, anyone who has half a brain cell and knows anything about smartphone cameras should know at this point, it should be beyond obvious that it is a 50-50 split. If you have slightly better hardware, but processing and sharpening is atrocious, you're never going to get an image that is decidedly better. And that is exactly what's happening on the Huawei. It has better hardware. I know it has better hardware. Which is why it breaks my heart to say that the processing is literally destroying the advantage that it should have had in this case. It should have significantly more detail, but it doesn't. But of course, that is not where the gimmicks end with the Huawei. I mean, I say gimmick, it's honestly like a technological marvel that we have because Huawei has a moving prism which basically shifts the light from a 3.7x lens to, I believe it's a 9.4x, which then just rounds up to 10x. So we can essentially have 10x hybrid optical shots because you also use a bit of a sensor crop on the Huawei alongside using the optical lens system. And because of that, despite the software still sharpening quite a lot, it's very obvious that having this hardware advantage, having a motorized prism that literally moves to a different lens structure and allows for significant levels of optical zoom, you are getting a much better image on the Huawei. But that's not all for detail preservation because now we have high resolution. And yes, high res in general is a niche feature that most people don't use. Even for someone like me, a huge enthusiast for smartphone cameras, I also don't like to use high res because oftentimes you don't get features like residential colors on the Vivo. So most of the time I'm just taking regular photos. However, there is a unique advantage that we have on the Huawei. Honestly, I don't know if it's because the software somehow fixes itself or maybe it's because we're taking high-res images. At the end of the day, what I do understand is that somehow, with the way the software works and the way the sharpening works, the processing works, high-res images look exceptional on the Huawei. Like it's a night and day difference. It doesn't even look like I'm using 50 megapixels on the X200 Pro. It's that good. The Huawei might just be one of the, if not the best, when it comes to high-res photography specifically. Now moving on, of course, we have the ultra-wide camera, which I must say, in this case, both phones are doing a tremendous job in terms of color accuracy. Like this, there's basically no magenta tint on the Huawei. Like that's insane. Now when it comes to detail preservation, it's not that big of a difference, I think, with the ultra-wide cameras. However, it is better on the Huawei. But then of course, we have the 3.7x telephoto cameras. Now this is where things are going to be even more interesting. So as we saw previously, 3.7x with 24 megapixels on the Huawei, it just doesn't stack up. The sharpening is way too excessive. The Vivo on the other hand, it may have a smaller sensor, but it does have more megapixels. Does that help? Well, we'll find out because first and foremost, we have the 50 megapixel shots. The Huawei is a bit smoothened while the X200 is a bit over sharpened. Honestly, not the biggest fan of either results here. I kind of expect a little bit more like natural sharpness on the Huawei, but well, overall I think without the over sharpening it looks better. However, 200 megapixels, does that actually give you a better result? Well, it's less over sharpened, it has slightly more detail, but there's still just a lot of sharpening artifacts right around the edges that you can see. I'm not the biggest fan of that on the Vivo. As far as I remember, I feel like the Vivo used to be a little bit better. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I just feel like the Vivo used to be a little bit better at handling the sharpness levels to give out the most natural detail as possible with the 200 megapixel mode. But that doesn't really seem to be the case. I'd say that this is a tie in terms of the fact that you're getting good detail but sharpness on the Vivo, and the exact opposite on the Huawei. It looks more natural but less detailed. Now lastly, we are dealing with night mode. Now here's the interesting thing. If you have seen my Vivo X200 Ultra camera comparison against the Huawei, you would have noticed I made a huge deal about having Zeiss's natural colors on the Vivo. That actually is a feature which doesn't exist on the X200 Pro. And definitely without Zeiss's natural colors, the X200 Pro's night shots are not nearly as natural as the Ultra. But compared to what the Huawei does, well, for the sake of the comparison, I guess we can very simply say that the Huawei goes a little too crazy with night mode, I think. Like the saturation and the way it handles contrast, it's enticing to look at, but also so obviously processed. It looks like very much like a smartphone photograph. That's the best description for it. Not in a bad way, but it is a characteristic that you're gonna get. If you don't like smartphone-esque photos, then the Huawei's night mode shots, you're not gonna like those. Even though I know that the X200 Pro's colors are not all that natural, they are a little oversaturated here and there, they immediately appear natural as opposed to the Huawei, because side by side, it's a huge difference in most cases. I think it also has a lot to do with the way contrast is handled. Like a lot of the mid-tone details are just brought out tremendously on the Huawei. And just as you would expect, you can basically say the same for ultrawide cameras as well. Although, I must say, the ultrawide shots do look a little bit better, weirdly enough, as opposed to the main camera shots. Less overprocessed would be the right word here, because the Huawei's processing, it goes crazy. So you know what, I'm gonna leave this up to you guys. You get far more natural colors on the X200 Pro. Not as natural again as the Vivo X200 Ultra, and I'm sincerely hoping that they bring a lot of those basic features like Zeiss natural colors with high resolution. You don't get that on the Pro, you get it on the Ultra. Zeiss natural colors with night mode. You don't get that on the Pro, you get it on the Ultra. They need to bring that over to the Vivo X300 Pro. Now with the Huawei, it's up there. Now I'm gonna leave it up to you guys, whichever one you want, just go for that. But in terms of detail preservation with 2x sensor crops, I would say there's not a huge difference between the two. Maybe some of the text is a little bit more legible on the X200 as opposed to Huawei, but it's such a minor difference that I don't think it really matters. Now with the 3.7x, see, this is where I'm hoping that the hardware advantage finally kicks in, because larger sensors, better light gathering capacity, and hopefully better detail, on the Huawei at least. Now I get it, this is not the best possible subject that I could have chosen, but you can probably tell in some cases, or in some of the parts of the image, there's a lot of texture on the wall. A lot of it is just being smoothed out. That's why it looks like there's basically nothing to really see when it comes to detail preservation. It's just being smoothed out on both. I can't really do much about that now, can I? But I would say there's not really much of a difference on either. But then 10x, see, this is where I have a lot of hope. 9.4x telephoto, hybrid telephoto zoom on the Huawei. Is it going to give us similarly better detail even at night? And well, it's better. It's definitely better. There's some weird processing going on the text, but overall everything else looks just better. More detail, less processing, less sharpening. It's simply better on the Huawei, without question. The 10x, that's a huge win. Alright then, here's the deal with the Huawei Pura 8T Ultra. I can confidently tell you that there are definitely areas where the Huawei just simply excels. I'm talking about the macro photography. I'm talking about high resolution. And of course, 10x zoom. Across the board, whether it's daytime, nighttime, doesn't matter. It's going to be better. And that's a significant deal when you think about the camera comparison. But in terms of practicality, there are quite a few major problems. The colors, especially, in the way that we just get a huge amount of magenta tint in a lot of cases, and the over-sharpening for regular images, that just becomes a bit of a problem, because even for someone like me, as I mentioned previously, it's just, I don't use high resolution nearly all that much. It's just not something I care about enough. Like, I'm not going to zoom in to 500% on all of the images that I take on a regular basis for personal use and so on and so forth. So I don't see a point in taking high res most of the time. Maybe I'll use it like 5% of the time, which is significant, but it is still not enough to justify all of the problems that we face in the Huawei. So in that regard, man, I wish that the colors could be fixed. Like the over-sharpening, that's not the biggest deal all of the time. At the very least, like, you'll only notice it when you crop in. So there is that problem. It shouldn't be a problem on a flagship of this caliber, but it is there. We can live with it. However, the magenta tint, it slaps you in the face, a lot of the times, and I really hate that. So I sincerely hope they can fix it. Well, with that said, I hope you guys found this helpful, and I'll see you guys soon enough with more. Cheers.